So there's one more message I wanted to impart about the beauty of nature to you. I was stuck in traffic, which in itself is not news in this city. But if you're on the 405 and you happen to be on the northbound side, there's an incredible bloom of orange California poppies. Now, nobody talks about beauty along our freeways very often, but that's what the rains have blessed us with. And so as you were singing, and I caught the phrase, Patach libi, which means open our hearts. And I think it's such a meaningful message that if we can open our hearts, not just to the beauty of nature, but also to the words of prayers, to the challenges brought with the messages from our clergy, to all the things that allow us to expand our thoughts and our experiences of the world, I think we'll look back on the days with our hearts more open and realize that they've been much more full than were we to close our hearts to the experiences in the world around us. So it's in that context that I want to share a message with you that I hope becomes a message of hope even as we look back on some rough times. Our friend Devora was visiting us from Israel this past week, and we were sitting around our kitchen table and chatting and talking about our families, as we always do, and she was talking about her Holocaust survivor mother-in-law. At 91 is often more focused on the past than the present, it sometimes seems. And they'll ask her sometimes, so Mom, how are you doing? And she'll respond, and I'm going to use my best version of Polish accented Hebrew, Haya yoter tov ba'Auschwitz. If you understand Hebrew, it means it was better in Auschwitz. Now, when Devora first said that to us, my mouth dropped, like, what could she possibly mean with that phrase? Is it some age-induced impairment, or is it a profound insight? And I came to understand that maybe it's a little bit of both. Because after all, how could Auschwitz be better than anything? And in that inscrutable meaning, well, it became clearer to me as I came across words from the prophet Zachariah. Zachariah preached in 540 BCE. And in his message, he reassures the Babylonian exiles living exiled from their land, apart from the temple, apart from the Holy Land. He says, you will be released, you prisoners of hope. Asirey hatikva, prisoners of hope. And then I realized that's what she means. She's an asirey hatikva, an asira hatikva. She's a prisoner of hope. She experienced the absolute worst prison that any human being could suffer, and yet she exited that prison alive. She emigrated to Israel. She married. She gave birth to children. Her children had grandchildren. She experienced the love of her grandchildren. Maybe what she means is not, it was better in Auschwitz, but rather she's saying, my entire existence is framed by the memory of Auschwitz. With Auschwitz in my memory, everything in life is both shaded by that darkness and that suffering, and placed in context by that same experience. My feet are anchored in the despair of Auschwitz, she says, but my heart embraces a light of hope. Asirey hatikva, prisoners of hope, said Zachariah. The American Muslim scholar takes that phrase, reads that phrase, and he elaborates on it. He says, hope is rooted in faith with feet mired in suffering. One has to recognize the true condition of the world and really feel it deep in your kishkas to experience meaningful hope. And Safi quotes Desmond Tutu, and he says, hope is being able to see that there is a light despite all the darkness. Now, it's very different from optimism. Optimism is about tinted glasses. It's about looking out in the world and saying, it'll all work out in the end. Isn't life terrific? Now, it might temporarily, briefly lift your spirits or not, But optimism, rose-colored glasses don't get the work done. Asirey hatikva, prisoners of hope, that's the core reference point for acting to improve the world. That's the core reference point for Tikkun Olam. Because changing the world for the better doesn't derive from starry-eyed optimism. It's not saying this too shall pass, because it won't unless we move forward with actions that make what needs to be changed. One has to first be mired in the circumstances of the world, experience, empathize with the true pain of those who suffer, the profound difficulty of fixing a problem, recognize the overwhelming challenges of moving forward with solutions, and the obstacles that will no doubt pop up along the way. One has to be a prisoner of hope. Because ultimately, moving forward requires looking back as well. Peering into the darkness, remembering it, even holding on to it. Haya yoter tov b'Auschwitz. It wasn't really better in Auschwitz, but I understand what needs to be done in the world because I experienced Auschwitz, and I'm driven to make it better because of those memories. This week, we recognize 20 years since the Iraq War. I should say the debacle that was the Iraq War. And it began a very dark time in history for this country. 20 years ago, we were all duped into supporting a misguided folly that was actually about settling old scores rather than addressing the root of the evil that brought down the World Trade Centers and killed 3,000 Americans. So we need to go into that darkness. Because by going into the darkness of remembering that war, we can act with hope to ensure that we don't repeat the needlessly self-inflicted errors that characterize that war. Now, I want to be really clear. I am not a pacifist. This is not an anti-war speech. There are times that war is necessary. And this message is not about all wars, but it's about a particularly devastating and purposeless war. So let's remember with some numbers what it was like. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld promised that we would spend less than $1 billion on the war. When all was said and done, the final total was $2 trillion. That's a 2 with 13 zeros as opposed to a 1 with 9 zeros after it. 2,000 times more than what he promised. 8,500 Americans lost their lives in that war. 300,000 more came home with debilitating PTSD. And the VA just released a report today that blacks are denied benefits for their PTSD more than people of any other color. Iraq lost 500,000 citizens. But there was unexpected fallout beyond the war. The U.S. lost credibility when Colin Powell appeared before the UN and gave what he ultimately found out to be a misleading speech. He regretted doing it, and he expressed profound anger that he was the one who had to deliver that misleading message. Nationally, the lies that led us to that war induced an insidious level of mistrust in the military and government. And it still pervades both political parties. Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders have integrated that distrust into their own politics. It's a toxicity that is so pervasive that it likely lies at the root of mistrust in the CDC as it sought to combat the COVID epidemic. It created an anti-war skepticism among both parties that actually worked against meaningful U.S. engagement and other international flashpoints. The resistance to supporting Ukraine in its battle against that monstrosity that is Vladimir Putin is an example. U.S. Ambassador Martin Indyk, Ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk, who's speaking here, by the way, April 3rd, has called the war a complete disaster on every level. And finally, far from creating a renewed democratic U.S. friend, the war pushed Iraq into Iran's orbit and made the Middle East, if that's possible, an even more dangerous region. Lieutenant General Jay Garner, who ran Reconstruction right after the war, said, "We overthrew Saddam and handed the country over to Iran. The whole thing's been a disaster. You had to be blind not to at least suspect that this would happen." Now, a cynic might say, "See, this is what governments do. This is why all wars are a waste of time, or nothing will ever change." An optimist might say, "We'll do better next time." But an asirey tikva, prisoners of hope, would say, we have to learn from the darkness. We have to learn from the death. We have to learn from the enduring pain of 300,000 Americans, of the 8,500 families that lost loved ones. We have to learn from the failures of government. We have to learn from the lies that were perpetuated. Because if we don't, how can we fix what's been broken? A prisoner of hope remembers the path and holds on to it. Holds on to the pain because the pain transforms the memory into action. This will not be the last U.S. war, nor will it be the last cataclysmic failure of government and policy. Of course, that's going to happen. But we who are asirey tikva, we who hold on to memories of the past, we who are prisoners of hope, in the words of Zachariah, we have to always raise our voices. We have to raise our voices in any way we can. We have to hold government accountable. We have to speak up. We have to protest. We have to make our voices heard, because we have to ensure that we make it just a little less likely that we'll do better next time. A little more likely, I should say, that we'll do better next time. And we have to remember and commit to the fact and the hope and the spirit that we will always be asirey tikva, prisoners of hope, real hope that makes change happen.